You are watching the wrong commodity. Every newsroom in the world is running oil price tickers. Brent above $100. Brent above 115s. Brent at 126. And yes, the oil story is real. The oil story matters. But there is a second story running underneath it. A quieter story. A more structurally dangerous story. And almost nobody covering the Iran war is leading with it. The story is gas. Specifically, the fact that the world has no backup plan for the gas that just stopped moving through the Strait of Hormuz. Let me explain why this is different. When oil markets get disrupted, the world has options. Strategic petroleum reserves, alternative suppliers, pipeline reroutes. Saudi Arabia and the UAE can move some of their crude through overland pipelines that bypass the strait entirely. It is not seamless, but the architecture of diversification exists for oil. Nations have been building it since 1973. 50 years of infrastructure decisions made specifically to answer the question of what happens when Gulf oil gets disrupted. Nobody built that infrastructure for gas. Because nobody believed it would be necessary. Here is the physical reality. Liquefied natural gas cannot move through a pipeline from Qatar to Europe or India. It has to be cooled to -260 degrees Fahrenheit, loaded onto specialized tankers, and shipped. And those tankers have to go through the Strait of Hormuz. There is no other way out. There is no pipeline alternative from the Gulf to anywhere. The Saudi oil pipeline that bypasses the strait carries crude, not gas. Qatar's gas has one exit. One. And that exit is now closed. On March 2nd, QatarEnergy halted production at Ras Laffan. 2 days later, it declared force majeure on every LNG contract it holds. I want you to sit with what force majeure means in this context. It is not a shipping delay. It is not a temporary reroute. It is QatarEnergy telling every buyer in the world, every utility company, every heating system operator, every industrial plant, that the contractual obligation to deliver your gas no longer exists. As of that moment, 20% of the world's entire LNG supply simply stopped. Not slowed. Stopped. And here is the thing the oil headlines are burying. Qatar is not like Middle Eastern oil production, which is spread across dozens of fields, dozens of facilities, multiple countries. Qatar's entire LNG operation runs through one complex, Ras Laffan, one industrial city on the northeastern coast of Qatar. The Rapidan energy analyst Alex Munton described it to CNBC as a sitting duck. His exact argument was this: if Iran wanted to do major damage to Qatar's LNG capacity, it could. There is no way to completely defend that plant against a determined Iranian attack. And crucially, he said, with oil you have many nodes. Too many fields, too many countries, too many facilities for any single strike to take out everything. With LNG it is one facility. One gigantic complex, but one. That concentration is what makes this gas crisis structurally different from every energy disruption since the 1970s. And it is what makes the restart problem so much harder than the news coverage is acknowledging. Rapidan predicts that LNG exports from Qatar will not resume until there is 100% certainty, not 90%, not reasonable confidence, 100% certainty, that it is safe for ships to transit the strait. Not because operators are being cautious. Because an LNG tanker costs $250 million. Because the cryogenic process of producing LNG cannot be ramped up and down based on daily conflict updates. Because QatarEnergy has said that even after the strait reopens, restarting Ras Laffan will take weeks to months, not days. The Qatar energy minister told the Financial Times directly, even if the conflict ended immediately, it would take weeks to months to normalize deliveries. Qatar has also announced it is delaying the expansion of its LNG facilities until 2027. The facility that was supposed to add additional supply capacity to global markets, the supply that Europe and Asia had been counting on to ease their long-term energy costs, is now pushed back by at least a year from the starting point of this conflict. Now let me get specific about Europe, because the European gas situation has a dimension the oil story does not have. European gas storage going into this crisis was at approximately 30%. That number is critical context. Europe exits winter with depleted storage and then spends the spring and summer months refilling for the following winter. The refilling season for 2026 started this month. March is when Europe begins the long process of rebuilding its reserves. And in March 2026, the supply that Europe was counting on to help fill those reserves has been removed from the market. The Dutch TTF benchmark, the primary pricing reference for natural gas across Europe, surged 63% in a single week, then doubled again in the following days. For context, the largest single weekly increase before this was during the Russia-Ukraine crisis in 2022. Europe spent 2 years and enormous political capital diversifying away from Russian gas after 2022. It built LNG import terminals. It signed long-term contracts with Qatar. It ran campaigns telling European citizens the gas dependency on autocratic suppliers had been solved. And now the supplier it pivoted to after Russia is also offline. Through a different geopolitical mechanism, but with the same physical result. The gas is not arriving. The specific country exposure inside Europe is uneven, and it matters. Belgium has gas storage at roughly 25%, below the EU average, and 8% of its LNG imports came from Qatar last year. Poland sourced 17% of its gas from Qatar in 2025. Italy is the most exposed of the large economies. Italy sourced approximately 22 to 30% of its LNG from Qatar, combined with relatively limited domestic storage infrastructure. When the analysis firms run the numbers, Italy comes up as the highest vulnerability major economy in the EU. On the other end, Portugal and Spain are relatively protected. Portugal sourced no gas from the Middle East since 2020. Its suppliers are Nigeria and the United States, on routes that have nothing to do with the Strait of Hormuz. Spain has diversified sources and reserves above 50%. This variation inside Europe is important because it means what is coming is not a uniform European energy crisis. It is a crisis that lands very hard on Italy, Belgium, Poland, and the countries that made the strategic bet on Qatar after Russia. And it lands relatively lightly on the countries that quietly built supply chains that bypass the Gulf entirely. The European Commission has stated there are no immediate gas shortages. That statement is technically true and practically misleading. There are no shortages today. The shortages come if this crisis extends into the summer refilling season, and Europe arrives at October with insufficient reserves for the 2026 to 2027 winter. That is the specific timeline that European energy ministers are actually worried about. Not today. October. Now India. India is the story that is getting almost no coverage in the Western press, and it is arguably the most acute physical exposure in this crisis. India has been on an aggressive LNG import expansion path. It imports LNG for power generation, for industrial feedstock, for fertilizer production. Unlike Europe, which has at least some pipeline gas from Norway as a partial alternative, India has no comparable backup. India's LNG comes from Qatar, from the UAE, from Gulf suppliers, and it moves through the Strait of Hormuz. There is no pipeline from Central Asia to India operating at meaningful scale. India cannot call on Norwegian pipeline gas. Russia can supply India with oil, and is doing so at significant volume. But Russian LNG infrastructure is limited, and the distances involved make rapid substitution economically difficult. India's fertilizer industry is the specific vulnerability that has the most downstream consequences. Indian agriculture runs on fertilizer produced from natural gas. The ammonia synthesis process that produces nitrogen fertilizers consumes enormous quantities of gas. When gas prices double or triple, fertilizer production costs follow. When fertilizer costs spike, food production costs follow. India has 1.4 billion people and a food price inflation problem that is already politically sensitive. Adding a gas-driven fertilizer shock to that in the middle of the spring planting season is not an abstract economic data point. It is a food security issue for the largest democracy on earth. Here is the asymmetry that the mainstream coverage is missing when it focuses on oil. Countries with oil exposure have options. They are bad options, expensive options, logistically complicated options. But the architecture of diversification exists. Countries with gas exposure from the Gulf have one option: wait for the Strait to reopen and wait for Qatar to restart. The U.S. LNG industry is running at maximum capacity. There is no switch to flip to produce more American gas in the short term. The CEO of Venture Global, one of the two largest U.S. LNG producers, was on an earnings call the week this started and said the U.S. stands ready to help. What he did not say, because he could not honestly say it, is that the U.S. can replace 20% of global LNG supply. Nobody can. The world is now running on 80% of the gas it had before February 28th, and there is no combination of alternative suppliers that makes up the remaining 20%. So the question becomes duration. 1 week of Hormuz closure is a price shock. 2 weeks is a supply chain stress event. 4 weeks is the beginning of structural damage to industrial operations in Europe and Asia. 6 weeks is when heating and power generation systems start making priority decisions about which users get gas and which do not. 8 weeks, arriving at May or June without a resumption of Qatari supply, means Europe enters the refilling season with no realistic path to adequate winter reserves. The White House has stated it needs 4 to 6 weeks to accomplish its stated objectives. That is their own timeline, 4 to 6 weeks. And in those same 4 to 6 weeks, the global gas market is running 20% short with no backup supply available. Those two timelines are on a collision course. And the people who set the 4 to 6 week military timeline made that calculation while sitting in a country where domestic gas prices barely moved, in a country that exports LNG rather than importing it, in a country whose gas supply has nothing to do with the Strait of Hormuz. That is the gas story. It is not the oil story. It is slower, less dramatic, harder to put on a ticker. But it is the one that determines what Europe looks like in November. It is the one that determines whether Indian farmers can afford fertilizer this spring. It is the one that determines whether the industrial base of countries that had no seat at the table when this war was decided goes into recession because a facility in northeastern Qatar cannot safely restart. The oil story has a price. The gas story has a duration. And duration is the variable nobody is measuring on the news crawl right now. Welcome to the geopolitics of money.